It was a rainy afternoon when Lisa, a hard-working single mother, heard the knock on her door that would change everything. She opened it to find Mr. Barnes, her landlord, standing there with a stern expression and a folded piece of paper in his hand. Lisa's heart sank as she took the notice from him, her fingers trembling. It was an eviction notice. Mr. Barnes, a wealthy white man with a long history of targeting tenants he saw as undesirable, had been watching Lisa closely for months. He had never made it a secret that he didn't like having her in his building, despite the fact that she kept her home spotless and had always done her best to pay rent on time. To Barnes, Lisa and her son Jamal were not the kind of tenants he wanted in his property. "This is ridiculous," Lisa said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm only a little behind on rent. You know I'm working 2 jobs, trying to keep up." Her eyes pleaded for understanding, but Barnes's expression remained cold. "That's not my problem, Ms. Johnson," Barnes replied, his voice dripping with indifference. "You've had more than enough chances to pay on time, and I'm done giving you breaks. You have until the end of the month to pack your things and leave." Lisa blinked back tears, trying to keep her composure. She knew her financial troubles weren't entirely her fault. She had been overcharged for maintenance fees, and her rent had been increased without warning. Unfair treatment that made it nearly impossible for her to stay afloat. Yet, here was Mr. Barnes, using her struggles as an excuse to get rid of her. "But where are we supposed to go?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "I just need a little more time. Please, think of my son. He's only 10. We have nowhere else to go." Barnes's eyes narrowed, showing not even a flicker of empathy. "You should have thought about that before you fell behind on rent," he said coldly. "My building is not a charity. You're out of chances." Without another word, Mr. Barnes turned and walked away, leaving Lisa standing in the doorway, clutching the eviction notice in her trembling hands. The weight of the situation bore down on her as she watched him leave, knowing that pleading with him would do no good. As she closed the door, Lisa slumped against it, feeling the tears she had been holding back finally fall. How could everything fall apart so quickly? She had worked so hard to give Jamal a stable home, but now it felt like the rug was being pulled out from under them. Jamal, sensing his mother's distress, came over and hugged her. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, his young face full of concern. Lisa wiped her eyes, forcing a smile. "Don't worry, sweetie. We'll figure something out." But deep down, Lisa didn't know how they would make it through this. Mr. Barnes didn't care about her struggles, and now they were on the verge of losing everything. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle, one that would change their lives forever. The next few days passed in a blur of panic and frustration for Lisa. Every moment was spent making phone calls, searching for any place she and Jamal could stay. The city's housing market was unforgiving, especially for a single black mother with limited resources. As Lisa dialed number after number, her hopes dimmed with every conversation. "I'm sorry, we're full," one landlord said without even letting her finish explaining her situation. Another promised to get back to her, but the call never came. Lisa could hear the hesitation in their voices, could feel the judgment even through the phone. The racial discrimination she had faced from Mr. Barnes wasn't an isolated incident, it was everywhere. People saw her name, heard her voice, and made assumptions. As the days passed, Lisa realized just how alone she was in this battle. No one was willing to offer the help she desperately needed, and the clock was ticking toward their eviction date. Every rejection felt like another door slammed in her face, pushing her and Jamal closer to the edge of homelessness. Late one evening, Lisa sat at the kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice as if it might magically change. The harsh reality of her situation pressed down on her like a heavy weight. This wasn't just about losing a place to live. It was about losing the stability she had fought so hard to provide for Jamal. The unfairness of it all gnawed at her. How could someone like Mr. Barnes, with his wealth and power, take everything away from them with the flick of a pen? Jamal sat across from her, quietly working on a drawing. His brow was furrowed in concentration, but every now and then, Lisa caught him stealing worried glances in her direction. He was only 10, but he understood more than she wished he did. He could feel the tension in the air, the anxiety that filled their small apartment like a storm cloud. "Mom," Jamal said softly, setting his pencil down, "are we really going to have to leave?" Lisa forced a smile, though her heart ached. "I'm doing everything I can, sweetie. We're going to figure this out, I promise." But even as she said the words, the doubt crept in. How could she make a promise like that when every option seemed to be closing in on them? She hated that Jamal had to see her like this, worried, helpless. But there was no hiding the truth from him. He wasn't a little boy anymore, and he could see the cracks in the world around them. Jamal, trying to be brave, reached across the table and took her hand. "It's going to be okay, Mom. I'll help. We can move somewhere better, right?" Lisa squeezed his hand, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Of course, baby. We'll find somewhere better." But deep down, Lisa knew that the system wasn't built for people like her. She wasn't the kind of tenant landlords wanted, not because of anything she had done wrong, but because of the color of her skin, the struggle she had faced, and the assumptions people made about her. As the days ticked by, Lisa and Jamal's world felt like it was shrinking. The walls of their apartment, once a sanctuary, now seemed to close in on them. And yet, through it all, Lisa clung to the hope that something, anything, would change. That maybe, just maybe, they would find a way out of this nightmare. Jamal, though quiet, was deeply affected by the situation. He didn't say much, but Lisa could see it in the way he kept to himself more, the way his schoolwork slipped, and the way he stared out the window as if looking for an answer that wasn't there. He was trying to be strong for her, but it was too much for a child to bear. As Lisa lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized something had to change. She couldn't keep fighting this battle alone. Not when the world seemed determined to push her down at every turn. But where would help come from? And how could she protect her son from the storm that was closing in? Little did Lisa know, a secret that had been buried for years was about to come to the surface, one that would change everything. While Lisa struggled to find a solution to her looming eviction, far from the pressures of her world, Mr. Barnes sat comfortably in his office, nursing a glass of whiskey. The eviction notice he had served Lisa had been one of many, just another move in his long history of pushing out tenants he considered undesirable. To him, it was all business, but beneath the surface, it was something far uglier. Later that evening, Barnes met with his lawyer, Evan, to discuss ongoing property matters. As they reviewed the tenant list, Barnes leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "So, Lisa Johnson and her boy are on their way out," he said, taking a sip of his drink. Evan raised an eyebrow. "She's only a couple months behind on rent, Barnes. Are you sure this eviction is necessary? There's been a lot of noise about discrimination lately. You don't want people looking too closely at your track record." Barnes waved his hand dismissively, his smirk widening. "You know what this is, Evan? It's not just about rent. Look, these kinds of tenants, they don't belong in my building. You know as well as I do that this neighborhood is changing, and I intend to keep it that way." Evan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had heard this rhetoric from Barnes before. There was nothing subtle about it. Barnes didn't want black tenants or minority tenants in his properties. He often masked his discrimination under the guise of keeping the building up to standards or rent-related issues. But the truth was, Barnes had been slowly but steadily forcing people of color out of his properties for years. "I get it, but you should be careful," Evan replied, trying to rein Barnes in. "People talk. If this comes back to bite you, it could cost more than a few rent checks." Barnes scoffed. "Let them talk. I've been doing this for years, and no one's ever touched me. I know how to play the game. Lisa Johnson is just another tenant who's going to find out that this building isn't for her kind." The words hung in the air, thick with the venom of his racism, but Barnes felt no shame. In fact, he thrived on it. To him, tenants like Lisa and others were a stain on the pristine image he wanted for his properties. He didn't care about the stories of hardship or the pleas for fairness. He only cared about keeping his buildings filled with people who fit his vision of acceptable tenants, people who look like him, wealthy and white. As the conversation continued, Barnes laughed with his lawyer about how easy it had been to evict tenants like Lisa. He had perfected the art of targeting black and minority renters, finding excuses to push them out under the radar of any legal repercussions. Late payments, noise complaints, and even fabricated violations were all tools he used to create a hostile environment, making tenants feel unwelcome until they had no choice but to leave. For Barnes, it wasn't just about Lisa or Jamal. Their eviction was part of a larger plan, a systemic effort to rid his properties of anyone he deemed undesirable. And in his mind, race played a large role in determining who stayed and who went. He leaned in toward Evan, his voice lowering. Do you know how much property values have gone up since I started doing this? By keeping the riffraff out, I'm bringing in the kind of people who actually add value around here. Evan, though visibly uncomfortable, nodded. He wasn't going to challenge Barnes. He knew too well that Barnes wielded a lot of power, and calling out his racism would be bad for business. Meanwhile, Lisa had no idea that her eviction wasn't simply the result of missed rent. She was part of a pattern, a much larger strategy designed to drive Black and minority tenants out of the building so Barnes could attract wealthier, whiter occupants. Her eviction wasn't just a matter of bad luck or timing. It was part of a carefully orchestrated campaign of discrimination that Barnes had been running for years. As Lisa scrambled to find a new home, Mr. Barnes remained confident in his ability to continue his plan unchecked. To him, evicting Lisa was just another win in his campaign to clean up his building, even if it meant destroying lives in the process. But Barnes's smug confidence was about to face an unexpected challenge. What he didn't know was that Lisa's son, Jamal, carried a secret. One that would soon turn Barnes's world upside down and force him to face consequences he never saw coming. As the days crept closer to the eviction date, Lisa felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. The notice pinned to her refrigerator was a constant reminder that time was running out. Every tick of the clock echoed in her mind, and every passing day brought her no closer to a solution. Lisa spent her days making frantic phone calls, her voice strained with desperation as she sought help from anyone who might offer it. She called friends, family members, and even distant acquaintances, hoping someone could provide a temporary place for her and Jamal to stay. Each conversation started the same way, with a glimmer of hope, but ended in heartbreak as she heard the same responses over and over. I'm sorry, I wish I could help, but the people she reached out to weren't uncaring. They were struggling themselves. Most lived in cramped apartments, barely able to support their own families. Offering a roof to Lisa and Jamal was a kindness many wanted to extend but simply couldn't afford. The doors were closing all around her, and Lisa found herself staring at her phone, feeling the overwhelming dread of nowhere left to turn. Desperate, she visited several local shelters, hoping they could offer some kind of temporary solution. But even there, the doors seemed to close in her face. The shelters were full, bursting at the seams with families in similar situations, people displaced, struggling to find housing in an unforgiving system. Lisa's heart sank as she looked around the crowded spaces, realizing that even the places designed to help the vulnerable couldn't accommodate her and Jamal. What am I supposed to do? She whispered to herself, trying to hold back tears. She couldn't afford to break down, not in front of Jamal. But the fear of homelessness loomed larger every day, and Lisa was beginning to accept the terrifying reality that they might end up on the streets. Jamal, though young, wasn't blind to what was happening. He had watched his mother grow more frantic with each passing day, and he could feel the panic settling into their small apartment. Gone were the comforting routines of home. They had been replaced by the stifling tension of uncertainty. He noticed the way she jumped every time the phone rang, hoping it was good news but knowing it rarely was. Mom, Jamal said one evening, his voice soft but full of concern. What's going to happen to us? Are we going to have to live somewhere else? Lisa turned from the dishes, her eyes meeting his. She knelt down beside him, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. We're going to be okay, baby, she said, though her own heart didn't fully believe it. I'm doing everything I can. We just need a little more time. But time was the one thing Lisa didn't have. The eviction date was fast approaching, and she had no solutions, no plans, and nowhere to go. Every avenue she explored led to dead ends, and the system seemed stacked against her. The reality of homelessness was closer than ever, and the pressure of trying to shield Jamal from that truth weighed heavily on her soul. The sleepless nights started to pile up. Lisa found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how her life had spiraled out of control so quickly. She had worked so hard to give Jamal a stable home, but now, through no fault of her own, that home was slipping through her fingers. Mr. Barnes's cruelty and the systemic injustices she faced were pushing her to the edge, and Lisa was running out of options. As the eviction date loomed just days away, Lisa could feel the walls closing in. The panic in her chest grew more suffocating with each passing minute. She had always been strong for Jamal, always found a way to make things work, but this time was different. This time, the stakes were higher, and the system seemed determined to push her down no matter how hard she fought. Lisa looked over at Jamal, who was pretending to focus on his homework but couldn't hide the worry etched on his young face. She knew he was trying to be strong for her, just as she was trying to be strong for him. But she also knew that they were both running out of strength. In the darkest moments of her desperation, Lisa found herself contemplating the unthinkable. What would happen if she and Jamal had to sleep in their car? Or worse, on the streets? The thought of her son, her baby, being exposed to the dangers of homelessness was too much to bear. But as the clock ticked closer to their eviction, that bleak possibility seemed more and more real. But little did Lisa know, just as all hope seemed lost, the answer to her prayers was about to appear in the most unexpected way. A secret from her past, a secret she had long buried, was about to resurface. And when it did, it would change everything. As word of Lisa's eviction spread throughout the neighborhood, reactions began to surface, but they were far from united. The streets that had once felt like home were now divided by whispers, sidelong glances, and hushed conversations. Some of Lisa's neighbors sympathized with her, offering quiet words of support or helping hands in small ways. But others, those who harbored their own hidden biases or feared stepping out of line, remained silent or quietly backed Mr. Barnes. "It's not fair what they're doing to her," one of Lisa's neighbors, Mrs. Alvarez, muttered as she stood outside her apartment, watching Lisa load yet another box into her car. "She's been a good tenant for years. Barnes is just trying to push her out." Others, however, weren't as kind. Mr. Collins, a longtime resident and a friend of Barnes, made his feelings known without a hint of shame. Lisa knew the rules. If she couldn't pay rent, she shouldn't have lived here in the first place, he said, shaking his head. Barnes is just running a business. It's nothing personal. But Lisa knew better. It wasn't just about the rent. There was an unspoken prejudice that had always lingered in the background, just out of reach, but always present. Systemic racism had a way of wrapping itself around her life like a shadow, influencing how she was treated without ever being openly acknowledged. The division among the neighbors was palpable. Some offered her their silent support, giving sympathetic nods as they passed her in the hallway, but they did little to stand up for her. They feared retaliation from Mr. Barnes, or perhaps they were simply too caught up in their own lives to get involved. Others avoided her altogether, acting as though her eviction was a fate she deserved. As Lisa packed, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of isolation. She had always believed that her community would rally around her in times of need, but now, she realized how alone she truly was. Every glance from her neighbors felt loaded with judgment or pity, but no one offered real solutions. The silence of those who stayed on the sidelines felt like a betrayal. Meanwhile, Jamal was struggling too. The uncertainty at home had seeped into every aspect of his life, most notably at school. His teachers, noticing the sudden shift in his behavior, expressed concern. Jamal, who had once been an attentive, hard-working student, now sat at the back of the classroom, distracted and disengaged. He couldn't focus on his assignments, couldn't concentrate on his math problems, or even muster the enthusiasm for things he once enjoyed, like drawing. The weight of their impending eviction was too heavy for him to bear. The uncertainty of where they would live, where he would sleep, and what would happen next loomed over him like a dark cloud. At recess, Jamal found himself sitting alone on the school steps, staring into space. His classmates played around him, laughing and running, but Jamal felt disconnected from their world. How could he think about games or fun when his life was on the verge of unraveling? Back at home, Lisa noticed the shift in her son's demeanor. He had grown quieter, more withdrawn, and his schoolwork had begun to suffer. The playful, curious boy she knew was slipping away, replaced by a child weighed down by fear and confusion. The thought of how this situation was affecting him tore at Lisa's heart. One evening, as Lisa sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, Mrs. Alvarez knocked on her door. She brought over a small casserole dish, a kind gesture that reminded Lisa there were still people who cared. "I'm so sorry you're going through this," Mrs. Alvarez said softly. "I wish there was more we could do." Lisa forced a smile, grateful for the kindness, but painfully aware of how little it changed their reality. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Still, the isolation Lisa felt was overwhelming. Systemic racism had always been part of her life in subtle, insidious ways. Whether in the workplace, in the school system, or now, in her fight to keep a roof over her head. Barnes's eviction notice was just one more battle in a war she had been fighting for years. Jamal, sensing his mother's despair, walked over and sat beside her, resting his head on her shoulder. "I don't want to leave, Mom," he said quietly. Lisa wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. "I know, baby, I know." As the days passed, the weight of their uncertain future hung over them both, leaving them anxious and fearful. The few neighbors who supported Lisa did what they could, but the overwhelming silence of the majority spoke louder than any words. It wasn't just an eviction. It was a systemic failure, a community that looked away when it was time to stand up. But what Lisa didn't know was that things were about to change in a way she never expected. Her son's secret, the one she had kept from the world for years, was about to come to light. And when it did, it would turn the entire situation on its head, leaving Mr. Barnes and the entire community shocked. The clock continued ticking toward eviction, and Lisa was growing more desperate by the day. She had exhausted every option she could think of, calling local shelters, housing programs, and even reaching out to legal aid. But every door she knocked on seemed to slam shut. As Lisa's situation became more dire, she turned to a social services office, hoping for some last-minute miracle that might save her and Jamal from homelessness. Sitting in a sterile office across from a social worker, Lisa nervously fidgeted with her hands. She had been through these meetings before. Long explanations, paperwork, and little hope at the end of it. The social worker, a kind woman named Ms. Rogers, had a calm demeanor as she reviewed Lisa's case. "You've been through a lot," Ms. Rogers said, flipping through the file in front of her. "It sounds like you've really tried every option available." Lisa nodded, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I've done everything I can, but nothing's working. I can't let them take our home away." Ms. Rogers hesitated for a moment, looking at Lisa thoughtfully. "You've mentioned your son, Jamal," she said slowly, "and that you're raising him on your own. What about his father? Is he in the picture at all?" Lisa stiffened at the mention of Jamal's father. It was a subject she had avoided for years, both for Jamal's sake and her own. James, Jamal's father, had been a complicated figure in her past, someone who once held a great deal of power but had been absent from her life for a long time. "No," Lisa said quietly, shaking her head. "He's not involved. We lost touch years ago." Ms. Rogers gave her a curious look, sensing that there was more to the story than Lisa was letting on. "Lisa, I don't want to push, but sometimes these kinds of connections can make a difference. I'm only asking because in situations like yours, especially with the eviction coming up, any additional support could be critical." "Does Jamal's father know about him?" Lisa's throat tightened, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. James didn't know about Jamal. In all the years that had passed since they lost contact, Lisa had never told him. There had been times when she considered it, but the circumstances were complicated, and she had wanted to protect Jamal from the uncertainty of his father's life. "No," Lisa finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't know. I never told him." Ms. Rogers sat back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "I see. Well, Lisa, I'm not here to judge your decisions. I understand why you might have kept that part of your life private. But if his father has any influence, any resources, it could make a big difference right now. It might be worth considering." Lisa frowned, her mind racing. She had spent years trying to build a life for herself and Jamal without leaning on anyone, especially not James. She wasn't even sure if he would want to help, or if he was even in a position to. But the social worker's words lingered in the air. Jamal's father could make a difference. Who is he? Ms. Rogers asked gently, sensing Lisa's hesitation. Lisa bit her lip, debating whether to say anything at all. But after a long pause, she finally spoke. His name is James. James Whittaker. Ms. Rogers' eyes widened slightly at the name. James Whittaker? As in, the James Whittaker? The political figure? Lisa nodded slowly. Yes, that's him. The social worker stared at Lisa for a moment, clearly surprised. James Whittaker was a man of great influence, known for his connections in politics and business. His name was well known in certain circles, though Lisa had been disconnected from his world for years. Lisa, I don't think you realize how important this could be, Ms. Rogers said, leaning forward. If James Whittaker is Jamal's father, this changes everything. He has the power to help you, especially with something like an eviction. You might want to consider reaching out to him. Lisa sat in stunned silence, the weight of the conversation sinking in. Could reaching out to James really be the solution? She had been so determined to protect Jamal from that part of her past. But now it seemed like James might be the only person who could help them avoid disaster. Years earlier, Lisa had met James Whittaker during a tumultuous time in her life. Back then, James had been a rising star, a man with ambition and connections that stretched far beyond anything Lisa had ever imagined. They had fallen in love quickly, but their relationship had been complicated by the demands of his political career. James had been a man of influence, with powerful friends and an even more powerful family. But as much as he cared for Lisa, his world had always been different from hers, and their relationship had faced challenges from the beginning. The more his career grew, the more distant he became, until one day, he was gone. Lisa had been left alone to face her pregnancy, and she never told James about Jamal. At first, it had been out of pride. Lisa didn't want to be seen as someone who needed help, but as the years passed, it became a way of protecting her son. She didn't want Jamal to be pulled into a world that might reject him. For years, Lisa had carried this secret, never telling Jamal about his father, and never reaching out to James. She had assumed it was for the best. But now, with their eviction looming and the walls closing in on all sides, Lisa began to wonder if her decision had been the right one. As Lisa left the social worker's office that day, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. James didn't even know he had a son, but he could be the key to saving them. The question now was, should she reach out to him? And if she did, what would that mean for her and Jamal? The choice wasn't easy, but as Lisa walked home with the eviction notice still hanging over her, she knew she couldn't ignore the possibility any longer. Reaching out to James might be their only chance to avoid losing everything. But the decision to reveal the truth would change their lives forever. Whether for better or worse, only time would tell. The weight of the decision hung heavy on Lisa as she sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone. Reaching out to James after all these years felt like a leap into the unknown. Would he remember her? Would he care that they had a son together? And even if he did, would he be willing to help? But as the eviction date loomed closer and Lisa's options dwindled, she knew she had to try. This wasn't just about her pride anymore. It was about protecting Jamal and finding a way to keep a roof over their heads. James Whittaker, with all his influence and connections, was their last hope. With a deep breath, Lisa typed James's name into the search bar. It had been years since she had thought about him in any real capacity, but his name still carried weight. James Whittaker was now a prominent figure in politics, with connections in high places and a reputation for fighting for social justice and fairness. Ironically, the very values he championed could save her from the injustice she and Jamal were facing now. But finding James wasn't going to be easy. His life had changed dramatically since they had parted ways. His public image was carefully crafted, and Lisa knew it wouldn't be as simple as picking up the phone and calling him. She wasn't even sure he would want to hear from her after all these years. Still, she couldn't let that stop her. The first step was finding a way to contact him directly, and that's where the uncertainty began. Lisa started her search online, combing through articles, interviews, and public profiles. James's name was everywhere. He had become a rising star in the political world, frequently mentioned in high-profile circles and respected for his advocacy work. But for all the media coverage, there was no direct line to reach him. His public presence was carefully guarded, and the only contact information she could find was for his team of assistants and political advisors. After a few days of searching and coming up empty, Lisa began to feel the emotional strain of the task. Every dead end left her more uncertain about whether this was the right path. Maybe James didn't want to be found. Maybe he wouldn't care. But she couldn't let her doubts hold her back, not when Jamal's future was on the line. She decided to take a bolder step. Lisa called one of the numbers listed for James's political office, hoping to get through to someone who could help her. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before a voice on the other end picked up. "James Whitaker's office, how may I assist you?" A professional-sounding woman said. Lisa swallowed her nerves. "Hi, my name is Lisa Johnson, and I need to speak with James Whitaker. It's personal. It's urgent." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that immediately made Lisa's heart sink. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Whitaker's schedule is extremely full. If this is a political inquiry, I can direct you to the appropriate team member." "No, this isn't about politics," Lisa insisted, her voice faltering. "This is personal. I need to speak to him about our son." Another pause, this one longer. Lisa could feel her hands trembling as she waited for the response. "I see," the woman finally said, her voice still professional, but now tinged with curiosity. "I'll pass along the message, Ms. Johnson, but I can't make any guarantees. Mr. Whitaker is very busy." "Please," Lisa said, her desperation slipping through. "I really need him to know about this." "I'll do what I can," the woman replied before hanging up. Lisa sat back in her chair, staring at the phone. The odds of that message actually reaching James felt slim. Still, it was something, a tiny glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. Days passed without any word, and Lisa began to fear the worst. What if James never responded? What if he didn't want to be involved in their lives? Lisa tried to prepare herself for that possibility, the idea that even if she found him, he might reject them. But just as Lisa was beginning to lose hope, her phone rang one evening. The number was unlisted, unfamiliar. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello? Lisa?" The voice on the other end was deep, familiar, and carried a weight of surprise and disbelief. "It's James." For a moment, Lisa couldn't breathe. After all these years, hearing his voice again felt surreal, like a distant dream suddenly made real. Her emotions caught in her throat, and she struggled to find the words. "James, it's been a long time," she managed to say, her voice shaking. "It has," James replied, his tone serious but not unkind. "I got your message. You said it's about our son?" The words hit Lisa like a tidal wave. There it was, out in the open. The secret she had kept for over a decade, now laid bare between them. "Yes," she whispered. "His name is Jamal, and he's your son?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Lisa could almost feel James processing the information. She knew this was a lot to take in, especially after so many years apart. But James was a smart man, and she could tell he was already piecing together the situation. "I don't know what to say," James finally admitted, his voice low. "This is unexpected. I didn't know how to tell you before," Lisa said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "And I didn't want to burden you with it. But now, things have changed. Jamal and I are about to lose our home, and I didn't know where else to turn." James was silent again, and Lisa's heart sank. Was this it? Was he going to walk away? But then, to her surprise, James spoke again. "Where are you living now?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I need to know everything, Lisa. I'll do whatever I can to help." Relief washed over Lisa, but with it came a flood of emotions. For years, she had shouldered the weight of raising Jamal on her own, and now, after so long, James was finally stepping into the picture. But even as hope flickered in her heart, Lisa knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty, and there were still many questions to answer. Would James truly be there for Jamal? Could he intervene before they lost everything? Only time would tell. As Lisa continued her desperate search for a solution to save her and Jamal from homelessness, Mr. Barnes was basking in what he saw as his inevitable victory. He paced confidently through the lobby of his building, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor as he made small talk with a few tenants who crossed his path. But in private conversations, Barnes's arrogance knew no bounds. In his office, he poured himself a celebratory glass of whiskey, smirking as he glanced at the eviction papers that would soon force Lisa and Jamal out of their home. The satisfaction of knowing that they would be gone soon filled him with pride. Another successful eviction of a tenant he deemed unworthy of his building. Only a few more days, he muttered to himself, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Finally, I'll get rid of that woman and her brat. Barnes saw Lisa as nothing more than a burden, a tenant who, in his eyes, represented everything he wanted to avoid in his properties. Her struggles with rent, her single motherhood, and, more than anything, her race, made her an easy target for his disdain. He had prided himself on slowly pushing out tenants like her, those he considered undesirable, to make room for the type of people he wanted: wealthy, white, and privileged. Later that evening, Barnes met up with Mr. Collins, one of his like-minded neighbors, for drinks. As they sat at a high-end bar downtown, Barnes couldn't resist boasting about his latest victory. "You wouldn't believe it," Barnes began, taking a smug sip from his glass. "That Lisa Johnson and her kid? They'll be out of my building by the end of the week. It's about time I got rid of them. I don't know why it took this long." Mr. Collins nodded, offering an approving grin. "Well, it's about time, Barnes. I don't know how you put up with it for so long. It's bad for business, keeping tenants like her around." Barnes chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I've got big plans for that building. New tenants, real money. Lisa was just a stepping stone. People like her, they're always temporary. I give it a week, tops, before I have someone more respectable in her place." The two men clinked their glasses, reveling in their shared sense of superiority. But as Barnes continued to gloat, a creeping sense of tension was growing behind the scenes. Tension he had no idea was about to explode. As the eviction date approached, Barnes felt unstoppable. He believed that Lisa and Jamal would soon be out of sight and out of mind, and he could continue his mission of transforming the building to his liking. He had no idea that Lisa's fight wasn't over yet, and that the help she was about to receive would change everything. After days of searching and countless dead ends, Lisa finally managed to connect with James Whitaker. It hadn't been easy, but the moment she heard his voice on the phone, something inside her shifted. For years, she had carried the secret of Jamal's father, never knowing if she would ever have to face this moment. But now, with her and Jamal's future hanging by a thread, Lisa knew she couldn't hold back any longer. They arranged to meet in person, and the reunion was bittersweet. James had agreed to see her, but the years that had passed since they had last spoken hung between them like a wall. When Lisa arrived at the upscale cafe where they were meeting, she was filled with a mix of relief and dread. She spotted James almost immediately, tall, well-dressed, and exuding the confidence of a man who had carved out a powerful place in the world. James stood as Lisa approached, his eyes widening in surprise as he took her in. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. "It's been a long time," James said quietly, pulling out a chair for her to sit. Lisa nodded, her heart racing. "Yes, it has." There was an awkward silence as they both sat down, but Lisa knew she couldn't delay the conversation any longer. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "James, I know this is a lot to take in, but I need to tell you about Jamal." James furrowed his brow, clearly confused. "You mentioned him on the phone. You said he's our?" Lisa nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Jamal is our son. I didn't tell you before because, well, a lot of things happened. We lost touch, and I didn't want to disrupt your life. I didn't think you would want to be involved." James was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, processing the bombshell that had just been dropped on him. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Lisa? All these years, and I had no idea I had a son." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, and she struggled to find the right words. "I was scared, James. Scared of what it would mean for you, for him. And I thought I could handle it on my own. But now, I can't do this alone anymore. We're about to lose our home, and I don't know what to do. James sat forward, his face softening as he saw the pain in Lisa's eyes. I don't know what to say, he admitted, shaking his head. I never imagined something like this, but I want to help. I don't want you or Jamal to go through this alone. Relief flooded through Lisa, but the moment was bittersweet. She had carried the weight of raising Jamal for so long, and now, after years of silence, James was finally stepping in. But it wasn't just about the past anymore. Jamal's future was at stake, and there was no time to dwell on the what-ifs. I'll do whatever I can, James promised, his voice steady. I'll reach out to some contacts, see if I can intervene before the eviction goes through. I'm in a position to help now, and I'll make sure that you and Jamal don't lose your home. Lisa nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Thank you, James. I didn't know where else to turn. As they sat together, the years of distance between them slowly began to melt away. It wasn't an easy reunion, but it was a necessary one. James's influence and connections were powerful, and now that he knew about Jamal, he was determined to use every resource at his disposal to protect his son. For Lisa, the relief was overwhelming. She had spent so long fighting this battle on her own, but now, for the first time, she had an ally who could truly make a difference. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with James's help, Lisa finally felt like there was a glimmer of hope in the darkness. With a promise to help Lisa and Jamal, James wasted no time using his influence and connections to dig into the details of Mr. Barnes's eviction practices. Over the years, James had developed a reputation for exposing injustice, and now, with his newfound personal stake in the matter, he was determined to bring Barnes's unethical actions to light. James contacted a private investigator and a team of legal experts who specialized in housing discrimination cases. What they uncovered was more than just Lisa's unfair eviction. It was part of a larger pattern of racial discrimination that Barnes had employed to drive out tenants of color from his properties. Barnes had been carefully crafting his image for years, covering his tracks with layers of paperwork and legal loopholes. But James's team was thorough, and soon the cracks in Barnes's facade began to show. The investigation revealed that Barnes had a history of unethical business practices, manipulating rent increases, fabricating violations, and pushing out families like Lisa's under the guise of building improvements. Several former tenants had experienced similar treatment, but many had lacked the resources to fight back, forced to accept their fate and leave quietly. James sat in his office late one evening, going over the documents his team had collected. His hands tightened into fists as he read through the evidence. Barnes had been systematically targeting people of color, using his wealth and power to create an atmosphere of fear and exclusion in his buildings. And now, Lisa and Jamal were his latest victims. This goes deeper than I thought, James muttered to himself, his mind racing. He picked up his phone and made a call to his legal advisor. We're going to expose him. This can't go on any longer. With James's connections in the legal world, it wasn't long before the case against Barnes began to take shape. Documents were compiled, witnesses were interviewed, and a clear pattern of racial discrimination was established. What started as an eviction case for Lisa had now become something much bigger, a fight against systemic racism in the housing industry. As James's investigation progressed, whispers of Barnes's discriminatory practices began to circulate in the business and legal communities. People who had once turned a blind eye to his actions were now forced to reckon with the truth. And Barnes, oblivious to the storm that was brewing around him, continued to gloat about his impending victory over Lisa. But he wouldn't be gloating for long. With the evidence in hand and James by her side, Lisa knew it was time to take the next step. She initiated a legal battle against Mr. Barnes, accusing him of racial discrimination and wrongful eviction. James connected her with a top civil rights attorney who was passionate about fighting housing inequality, and they filed a lawsuit that would not only challenge her eviction but also bring Barnes's entire business under scrutiny. The lawsuit didn't go unnoticed. Once the legal papers were filed, the story quickly gained traction, drawing the attention of the media. What began as a personal battle for Lisa and Jamal turned into a national story about housing inequality, systemic racism, and the abuse of power by wealthy landlords. News outlets picked up on the lawsuit, framing it as a case that could expose the ugly realities of racial bias in the housing market. Before long, the story was everywhere. Reporters began contacting Lisa, asking for interviews, and her case became a symbol of the broader struggle that many families of color faced when trying to secure fair housing. The media painted Barnes as a ruthless landlord, unafraid to use his power to push vulnerable families out of their homes for profit. Barnes, once confident in his ability to evict Lisa and Jamal without consequence, now found himself at the center of a public firestorm. Protests began forming outside his properties, with activists calling for justice and demanding an end to discriminatory housing practices. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForLisa and #StopHousingRacism, and people from across the country began to rally behind Lisa's case. The pressure mounted as Barnes's legal team scrambled to defend his actions. But with James and his powerful connections backing Lisa, the tide of public opinion had already turned. What Barnes had once dismissed as just business had now become a national movement, and his reputation and fortune were on the line. The legal battle officially began in court, where Lisa and her team laid out the evidence of racial discrimination and unethical evictions. Former tenants came forward to testify, sharing their stories of being pushed out by Barnes in similar ways. The courtroom was filled with tension as Lisa's legal team painted a damning picture of Barnes's practices. But as the case progressed, Barnes's arrogance began to crumble. He had never anticipated that evicting a single mother and her child would lead to this level of public backlash. He had believed that his wealth and power would protect him, but now, with the spotlight on his actions, Barnes was facing a reckoning he had never expected. Outside the courthouse, support for Lisa continued to grow. People of all backgrounds stood in solidarity, demanding accountability for landlords like Barnes who used their influence to oppress vulnerable families. The fight for fair housing had finally reached the national stage, and Lisa's case had become the catalyst for change. Barnes, once so sure of his victory, was now fighting for his reputation, and possibly his future as a landlord. But with the overwhelming evidence against him and the power of public opinion shifting in Lisa's favor, Barnes's downfall seemed inevitable. The legal battle had only just begun, but already the tide was turning. Lisa and Jamal were no longer just victims of a wrongful eviction. They were the face of a larger movement for justice, and with James at their side, they were determined to see this fight through to the end. The once untouchable Mr. Barnes was beginning to feel the walls close in. What had started as a routine eviction, one he had carried out countless times before, had spiraled into a full-blown crisis. The media was covering the lawsuit on every major outlet. James Whitaker's involvement had made it a national story, and protesters were now gathering outside his properties, demanding justice for Lisa and an end to discriminatory housing practices. Barnes's confidence had evaporated. In his sleek office, which had always felt like a fortress, he now felt exposed. He paced back and forth, his mind racing with panic as he listened to his lawyer, Mr. Donovan, explain the growing magnitude of the situation. "This is bigger than just an eviction, Barnes," Donovan said, his voice sharp. "We're talking about systemic racial discrimination. The media has painted you as the face of everything that's wrong with the housing market. People are digging into your past evictions, your business practices. It's all out there now. And with James Whitaker involved, we're not just fighting Lisa. We're fighting a political figure with massive influence." Barnes's face flushed with frustration. "I don't care about the media. This was supposed to be easy. She couldn't pay rent, so she had to go. It's that simple. How did this blow up like this?" Donovan sighed, shaking his head. "You don't understand, Barnes. This isn't just about Lisa anymore. The media is framing this as a fight for housing equality and racial justice. Every eviction you've ever done is being scrutinized, and it's not looking good. People are starting to come forward with their own stories, and the more attention this case gets, the worse it's going to be for you. This could destroy your career, your reputation, everything." Barnes sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. "What are you saying? We settle?" Donovan hesitated. "It might be your best option. If this goes to trial, the evidence of your discriminatory practices could sink you. And if Whitaker keeps pushing this, you'll be dragged through the mud publicly. Settling might at least give you some control over the damage." But the thought of settling made Barnes feel sick. He had built his fortune on the backs of tenants like Lisa, quietly pushing them out of his properties with little to no consequence. And now, for the first time, he was the one on the defensive, being forced to confront his actions in a very public way. His arrogance had blinded him to how much power a single tenant, and the right connections, could wield. "I'm not going to lose everything over some single mother," Barnes muttered angrily. But even as he said it, he could feel the fear creeping in. The pressure was immense, and the lawsuit was quickly becoming bigger than anything he had anticipated. He knew that if things continued the way they were going, his career, and his carefully built empire, could come crashing down. While Barnes scrambled to contain the fallout, Lisa was finding herself at the heart of something far larger than she could have imagined. The lawsuit had given her a voice, but more importantly, it had given the community a voice as well. For years, many tenants had been subjected to the same discriminatory practices and mistreatment by landlords like Barnes, but fear and powerlessness had kept them silent. Now, with Lisa's lawsuit making headlines, people were coming out of the woodwork to share their own stories. Neighbors who had once remained quiet began to rally around her and Jamal, offering their support and sharing their experiences with racial discrimination in the housing market. One day, Lisa received a knock on her door. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Alvarez, one of her neighbors, standing there with a small group of other tenants. They carried signs and wore determined expressions on their faces. "We're here for you, Lisa," Mrs. Alvarez said, offering a warm smile. "We've all had our run-ins with Barnes. He's been pushing us around for too long, and it's time we stand together." Lisa was taken aback by the sight. She had spent so many days feeling isolated, thinking she and Jamal were fighting this battle alone. But now, as she looked at the faces of her neighbors, people who had experienced the same injustices, she realized that her fight was part of a larger movement. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood and beyond. More tenants came forward, some of them former residents who had been evicted by Barnes in the past. They told their stories to reporters and stood in solidarity with Lisa. The local community became a hub of activism, with people organizing rallies and protests outside Barnes's office, demanding an end to housing discrimination. And it wasn't just tenants. Activists, civil rights organizations, and even local politicians began to take notice. What had started as a personal struggle for Lisa was now at the center of a movement that was exposing the darker side of the housing market. People were fed up with landlords like Barnes who abused their power, and Lisa's case had become a symbol of resistance. Every day, more people gathered outside Barnes's properties, chanting slogans like "Justice for Lisa" and "End housing discrimination." The media continued to cover the story, amplifying the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. Lisa, who had once felt so powerless, now found herself standing tall among a community that was finally standing up for itself. She was no longer just a single mother fighting to keep a roof over her head. She was part of a larger movement, one that was demanding justice not just for her, but for all the families who had been mistreated. As she walked through the crowd of supporters, Jamal by her side, Lisa felt a renewed sense of purpose. The legal battle was far from over, and there were still challenges ahead, but she wasn't alone anymore. The community had rallied around her, and together, they were fighting for something much bigger than a single eviction. And as the pressure mounted on Barnes, Lisa knew that change was finally within reach. While the legal battle against Mr. Barnes intensified, Lisa knew that there was one more conversation she couldn't put off any longer. It was time for Jamal to learn the truth about his father. She had shielded him from this part of their past for so long, out of fear and uncertainty, but now that James had come back into their lives, there was no avoiding it. One evening, after dinner, Lisa sat down with Jamal at the small kitchen table. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "Jamal, there's something important I need to tell you. It's about your father." Jamal, always curious but never pushy about the subject, looked up at her, his big brown eyes filled with quiet anticipation. "What about him, Mom?" he asked softly. Lisa reached for his hand, holding it tightly as she began to explain. "Your father, his name is James Whitaker. He's a very powerful man, someone who's done a lot of good in the world. And he didn't know about you until recently." Jamal's eyes widened. "He didn't know about me? Why didn't you tell him?" Lisa sighed, her heart heavy with the memories of the years that had passed. It's complicated, sweetheart. When I found out I was pregnant, James was busy with his career, and we lost touch. I was scared. I didn't want to disrupt his life, and I thought I could handle everything on my own. But things have changed now. He's back in our lives, and he knows about you. Jamal sat quietly for a moment, processing what he had just heard. So, my dad is someone important? Lisa nodded. Yes, he is. He's been helping us with this legal battle, making sure that we get the justice we deserve. But more than that, he wants to be part of your life now, Jamal. He wants to get to know you. Jamal's initial shock gave way to a sense of pride. He had always wondered about his father, and now that he knew who James was, it filled him with a renewed sense of hope. I'm happy to know who my dad is, he said quietly, a small smile forming on his face. I want to meet him, Mom. I want to know more about him. Lisa's heart swelled with emotion. She had feared how Jamal would react, but seeing the calm acceptance in his eyes reassured her. Their bond deepened in that moment as they shared in the new chapter of their lives, navigating this journey together. With James now fully in the picture, he pulled every string and used every resource at his disposal to ensure that Lisa had the best legal representation possible. The trial was looming, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The case wasn't just about Lisa's eviction anymore. It had become a symbol of housing inequality and racial injustice, and the world was watching. In the days leading up to the court date, Lisa's legal team worked tirelessly, preparing to expose Barnes's long history of discrimination and targeting tenants of color. James spared no expense, hiring expert witnesses and legal professionals with a deep understanding of housing law and civil rights. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about sending a message. The courtroom was packed when the trial finally began, with reporters, activists, and members of the community filling the benches. Lisa sat next to her attorney, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. Jamal, sitting just behind her with James, watched with wide eyes as the case began to unfold. The legal team wasted no time in presenting the damning evidence against Barnes. They highlighted his pattern of pushing out black tenants, raising rents unjustifiably, and using evictions as a weapon to clear out neighborhoods for wealthier, predominantly white tenants. Witnesses took the stand, sharing their stories of mistreatment at Barnes's hands, painting a clear picture of racially motivated discrimination. This eviction was never just about rent, Lisa's attorney said during opening arguments. It was about race. Mr. Barnes has been systematically driving out families of color from his properties, and Lisa Johnson is just one of many victims. But today, we expose the truth. Barnes sat across the courtroom, his face pale as the evidence piled up against him. His once confident demeanor had cracked, and now he looked uneasy, knowing that the truth was unraveling in front of everyone. The media continued to cover every development, broadcasting the trial across the nation. It wasn't just a courtroom battle. It was a public reckoning, a moment of accountability for landlords like Barnes who had preyed on vulnerable families for years. As the trial moved forward, Barnes's defense began to crumble under the weight of the evidence. His attempts to justify the eviction as purely financial were met with skepticism from the judge, who was clearly seeing through Barnes's lies. Barnes's legal team tried to argue that Lisa had been behind on rent and that the eviction was nothing more than a business decision. But each time they presented their arguments, Lisa's attorneys countered with evidence of racial bias, including emails and internal documents that showed Barnes's clear preference for wealthier, white tenants. His pattern of targeting black families for eviction was undeniable, and the court began to see that this case was about much more than a missed rent payment. When Barnes took the stand to defend himself, his arrogance faltered. The prosecutor's cross-examination was relentless, forcing him to admit that he had evicted black tenants at a far higher rate than white tenants. The courtroom fell silent as Barnes stammered through his answers, unable to provide a legitimate reason for the disparities. You've evicted multiple black families from your properties, the prosecutor said, narrowing his eyes at Barnes. Isn't it true that you've done this to make room for wealthier, predominantly white tenants? Barnes's face flushed. That's not the reason, he stammered. It's just business. I run a business. But this so-called business seems to target families of color, does it not? The prosecutor pressed. Is it coincidence that most of the families you've evicted happen to be black? Barnes couldn't answer. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that his defense was falling apart. His long history of racially motivated evictions had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping it. As the trial neared its conclusion, it became apparent that Barnes was no longer just fighting an eviction case. He was facing the consequences of his years of unethical behavior. The court, the public, and even Barnes's own defense team knew that this battle was one he couldn't win. As the trial entered its final stages, the courtroom drama spilled out into the streets. Lisa's case had struck a chord with the public, and people from all walks of life rallied behind her. Protests formed outside the courthouse, with hundreds of people holding signs demanding justice for Lisa and Jamal. The chants of housing for all and end racial discrimination echoed through the streets as more and more people joined the movement. The media coverage had turned Lisa's lawsuit into a national story, and her fight against Mr. Barnes had become a symbol of the broader struggle against housing inequality. Civil rights activists, housing advocates, and even politicians began to take notice, calling for reforms that would hold landlords accountable for discriminatory practices. Every day of the trial, the crowd outside the courthouse grew larger. People shared their own stories of being wrongfully evicted or mistreated by landlords, and Lisa's case became a catalyst for change. The public outcry wasn't just about one eviction anymore. It was about systemic injustice in the housing market that disproportionately affected Black and minority families. Inside the courtroom, Lisa could feel the weight of the movement behind her. As she sat beside her legal team, she knew she wasn't just fighting for herself and Jamal anymore. She was fighting for all the families who had been silenced, mistreated, and pushed aside by landlords like Barnes. And with the world watching, the pressure on the court to deliver justice had never been greater. James, sitting with Jamal in the courtroom, was impressed by the outpouring of support. He had always known the power of public opinion, but seeing so many people stand up for Lisa and her cause filled him with a deep sense of hope. Lisa's bravery had inspired a movement, and now, that movement was demanding accountability. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The evidence against Barnes was overwhelming, but the outcome was still uncertain. Would the court finally hold him accountable for his racial discrimination, or would he manage to slip away unscathed? Outside, the crowd continued to grow, their voices rising in unison. Justice for Lisa. The day of the verdict arrived, and the courthouse was packed with reporters, activists, and supporters waiting anxiously to hear the decision. Lisa sat at the front of the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest as the judge prepared to announce the ruling. The judge's voice cut through the tension like a knife. After reviewing the evidence presented in this case, it is clear that Mr. Barnes engaged in racial discrimination in his eviction practices, specifically targeting tenants of color, including Ms. Lisa Johnson. A collective breath seemed to be held as the judge continued. This court finds Mr. Barnes guilty of racial discrimination and wrongful eviction. He is hereby ordered to pay significant damages to Ms. Johnson and her family for the harm caused by his actions. Lisa felt tears welling up in her eyes as the words sank in. They had won. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps, while outside, the crowd burst into cheers and applause. The judge's ruling had sent a powerful message. Landlords like Barnes could no longer hide behind their wealth and influence. They would be held accountable for their actions. Barnes sat at the defense table, his face ashen and his once arrogant demeanor shattered. The damage to his reputation was irreparable, and his business empire, built on the exploitation of vulnerable tenants, was now crumbling. The significant damages he was ordered to pay would barely scratch the surface of his downfall. For Lisa, the verdict was a vindication, not just for herself, but for Jamal and for all the families who had been mistreated. She looked over at Jamal, who sat beside James, his face filled with pride. They had come through the storm together, and now, for the first time in a long time, they could begin to rebuild their lives with dignity and support. As Lisa left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted in cheers, chanting her name and waving signs that had become the symbols of their fight. Lisa smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had fought for justice, and now, she and Jamal could move forward with hope. For Mr. Barnes, the courtroom defeat was only the beginning of his downfall. In the days following the verdict, other tenants who had suffered under his discriminatory practices began to come forward, filing lawsuits of their own. Families who had been evicted, mistreated, or racially targeted by Barnes now saw an opportunity to hold him accountable. Soon, Barnes was buried under a wave of legal challenges. His once thriving business empire, built on years of exploitation, began to crumble as more and more tenants came forward with evidence of his unethical practices. The media continued to expose his wrongdoings, and the pressure on Barnes grew unbearable. His properties, once filled with wealthy tenants, began to empty as renters fled from the bad press and the looming threat of lawsuits. Investors pulled their support, and business deals collapsed. Barnes, who had once been untouchable, now found himself isolated and disgraced. The final blow came when Barnes was forced to sell off his properties to cover the mounting legal fees and damages he owed. The once powerful landlord was now reduced to scrambling for what little remained of his fortune. His name became synonymous with greed, racism, and injustice, and his fall from grace was broadcast for the world to see. Lisa's victory in court had become a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire community. Barnes's downfall served as a stark reminder that justice would catch up to those who abused their power. As Lisa and Jamal began to rebuild their lives, the community around them rallied in support. They had been through a long and painful battle, but in the end, they had won. Lisa's strength, courage, and perseverance had brought about real change, and now, with Barnes out of the picture, they could finally move forward. For James, seeing Lisa and Jamal thrive after the trial filled him with pride. He knew there was still work to be done, but for now, he was grateful to be part of their lives and to have played a role in ensuring they received the justice they deserved. Barnes, meanwhile, had become the cautionary tale, a racist landlord brought to justice. His legacy was in ruins, and his once golden reputation was now nothing more than a reminder that the fight for racial equality was far from over. For the first time in months, Lisa and Jamal could finally breathe easily. The weight of the eviction, the stress of the trial, and the uncertainty that had plagued them for so long was now behind them. Justice had been served, and Barnes's attempt to strip them of their home and dignity had backfired spectacularly. Lisa sat in their modest apartment, now secure in the knowledge that they wouldn't have to move out. The eviction was overturned, and the damages awarded in the trial gave her a level of financial stability she hadn't experienced in years. The fear of being unable to provide for Jamal was gone, replaced by the comfort of knowing that they were safe. James, now an active part of their lives, had been a steady source of support through the trial and afterward. As Lisa watched Jamal interact with his father, she felt a surge of gratitude. Despite the years of distance and the uncertainty about whether James would step up, he had proven to be reliable and committed. He promised Lisa that he would continue to be there for Jamal in every way he could, emotionally, financially, and as a guide. "Whatever you need, Lisa," James had said one evening after the trial. "I'm here for you both. I won't let you or Jamal go through this alone ever again." Lisa felt the tension that had gripped her for so long finally start to release. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could picture a future filled with hope. The fight was over, and she and Jamal had won. Not just the court battle, but the battle for their future. For Jamal, the trial and everything that followed had been an emotional roller coaster. But now, knowing who his father was and seeing his mother finally at peace, he began to feel a new sense of confidence. For years, Jamal had carried the burden of their struggles in silence, never fully understanding the extent of what his mother was going through. But now, with James as part of his life, Jamal saw his world expanding. He felt more secure, more supported, and with the love of both his parents, he finally believed that his future could be bright. At school, the change in Jamal was noticeable. His performance began to improve, and the teachers who had once worried about his distraction and anxiety now saw a focused, confident young boy who was eager to learn. He had a renewed sense of purpose, and the hope that had been missing during the dark days of the eviction battle had returned. With James's influence, Jamal also began to see a wider world of possibilities. James introduced him to new opportunities, encouraging him to explore his passions and giving him access to experiences that Lisa had always wanted for him but couldn't afford. Jamal's self-esteem soared as he saw that his life wasn't limited by their past struggles. As the months passed, the bond between Lisa, Jamal, and James grew stronger. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. For Jamal, this was the start of a new beginning, one where he could dream big and have the support of a loving family behind him. Lisa watched Jamal flourish, her heart swelling with pride. She had fought for him every step of the way, and now, seeing him happy, she knew it had all been worth it. With the courtroom battle behind her and a new sense of security for herself and Jamal, Lisa felt a fire within her that she had never known before. The injustice she had fought against, the discrimination, the exploitation, was something she knew too many families still endured. Now, with the support of James and the resources from the damages she had won in court, Lisa decided to turn her personal victory into something much bigger. Empowered by her triumph, Lisa began advocating for housing rights, especially for single mothers and low-income families who were often targets of predatory landlords. She reached out to local organizations and housing advocates, lending her voice to the cause. What had once been a quiet struggle for survival was now a public fight for justice. Lisa and James partnered to start a foundation that provided legal support, financial assistance, and housing resources to families facing wrongful evictions and discrimination. The foundation quickly gained traction as Lisa's story had resonated with so many people across the country. Her voice, once silenced by fear and uncertainty, now became a powerful tool for change. She gave speeches, appeared at rallies, and worked with housing advocates to push for legislative reform. Lisa was no longer just a single mother fighting for her family. She had become a leader in the fight for housing justice. Through her work, she ensured that others who faced the same obstacles would have the support they needed to fight back and win. Every family deserves a safe, stable home, Lisa said in one of her speeches. I fought for my son, for our future, and now I'm here to help others fight for theirs. We will not be silenced anymore. Through the turbulence of their legal battle and the fight for justice, Lisa, James, and Jamal had grown closer than they ever could have imagined. What started as a painful separation between Lisa and James had blossomed into a new chapter for them, a chapter built on trust, love, and support. Though the years they had lost couldn't be reclaimed, they were focused on creating a brighter future together. Lisa had gone from being a struggling single mother to a strong, empowered woman, and James was by her side, ready to help her achieve even more. Together, they worked to build a new life for Jamal, ensuring that he had everything he needed to succeed. The love and support from both parents gave Jamal the confidence he had longed for, and he began to thrive not only in school but in all areas of his life. As a family, they enjoyed the simple moments, family dinners, weekends together, and celebrating Jamal's milestones. The once uncertain future now felt full of possibilities, and with each passing day, they grew closer. Jamal, who had once felt unsure of his place in the world, now knew that he was surrounded by unwavering love and support. Though the past had been filled with challenges, they had emerged stronger. Lisa, James, and Jamal were no longer bound by the pain of what had happened, but were now united in their determination to build a better future, together. The story of Lisa's fight for justice did not end with her personal victory. What had started as a desperate struggle to save her home had turned into a national movement for change. Lisa and James knew that their story had the power to inspire others, and they used their newfound platform to launch a national campaign for housing reform. Together, they traveled the country, speaking at events and working with lawmakers to push for legislative changes that would protect vulnerable families from predatory landlords and ensure equal housing rights for all. Their foundation grew, providing support to thousands of families and helping to prevent evictions through legal aid and financial assistance. Lisa's personal battle had become a symbol of resilience and determination. She was no longer just a mother who had been wronged by the system. She was now a leader who had stood up to injustice and won. Her voice became a beacon of hope for others, showing them that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The campaign for housing reform gained national attention, and soon, new laws were being proposed and passed that held landlords accountable for discriminatory practices. Lisa's story, along with the work she and James were doing, helped to create a ripple effect that impacted communities across the country. As Lisa stood on stage at a housing rights rally, looking out at the crowd of supporters, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride. She had come so far from those dark days of fear and uncertainty, and now, she was part of something so much bigger than herself. Her fight had become a legacy of change, and she knew that the work they were doing would continue to make a difference for generations to come. With James by her side and Jamal thriving, Lisa's story was no longer one of survival. It was a story of hope, justice, and empowerment. The fight for fair housing was far from over, but Lisa had proven that one person's voice could spark a movement. Her legacy, as a single mother who had stood up to injustice and won, would leave a lasting impact on the nation, and her story would continue to inspire others to do the same.
I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you.